Let's evaluate the state of the economy and what can be done to improve American standard of living with our next guest, Tomas Philipson, currently the Daniel Levin Professor of Public Policy Studies, Emeritus at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, and the former acting chairman of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. Tomas, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Good to be with you.
Honored to host you. Let's talk about this cost of living crisis that you've been talking to the other media about for the last couple of years. I know this was a big topic back right when the pandemic hit, when inflation skyrocketed thereafter. Is it still an issue today? Are we still having a cost of living crisis in 2024, Tomas?
Well, it's certainly not as much as it was in 22 and 23, essentially. But if you look, since Biden took office, it's been a dramatic sort of increase in prices relative to how much people earn. So people's what we call real income as opposed to nominal income. Real income is how much you can buy with your paycheck. And that's pretty much either flat or decreased during those years, which is it's supposed to be growing at least, 2% a year or something like that. And in fact, once you come out of a recession, such as a deep one as deep and short as COVID was, it should be much easier to grow because basically people come into the office and turn on the lights again, essentially. And so it's kind of the lack of growth, both in real income and GDP, together with enormous deficit spending to try to prop up the economy, has been kind of a remarkable combination, given that it should be growing much faster. If you looked at what happened in Q4 in 2020, just after the pandemic, we had 6% annualized GDP growth in that quarter, no inflation, et cetera. So it was kind of a V-shaped recovery taking place, but then that got sort of abrupted in 21, 22, and 23. And that cost of living crisis is a lot of source of many, many problems in the economy, including, I think, a weak labor market. People say we have a strong labor market, but they're confusing sort of the quantity of labor, that is to say labor force participation or unemployment, with the price of labor, which is real wages. So workers don't like the labor market because real wages are flat or down or not progressing. So in terms of the labor market, it hasn't been great that way either. And stock market, same thing. Stock market, people think it's great because it's breaking nominal records currently. But if you look at the real return in stock markets, taking out inflation, it's only been about 3 to 4% per year under Biden, which is dismal compared to the 7-8% we usually have in real returns in the stock market. So I think the inflation is hitting economy-wide all over. It also hitting a lot of voters, and that's why it's so troublesome for elected officials when inflation hits. It's not like unemployment, which hits a few. Inflation hits everyone.
Oh, I want to come back to the labor market in just a bit, but on inflation, how much of this reduction in inflation from 9.1% to what we have now, Tomas, can be attributed to Biden's Inflation Reduction Act that was signed in 2022?
Well, probably zero. That probably had a negative effect in terms of raising inflation with all the government deficit spending that took place. The only thing they did in terms of what they're saying is reducing prices is price controls on pharmaceuticals, which in my view is very, very harmful because it's ultimately what makes headways in healthcare is new innovation that brings in treatments that couldn't otherwise generate the health it could. And those price controls, that's a separate issue. They are touting as an inflation reducer, but actually drug pricing, which went down for the first time under Trump ever, have now risen dramatically under Biden. So prices for drugs are not coming down, certainly, even though they claim that that act did that. I think it's a very misnamed act because most economists, I think, believe it stimulated inflation as opposed to reduced it.
Which component of the CPI do you think is still most unaffordable for Americans? Is it food, shelter, energy, services, all of the above, none?
Well, if you look at price increases, and this is kind of missed many times, the price that has increased the most, we talk about food increasing 20%, energy 30% plus, whatever. The price that has increased more than 100% is the price of credit. So if you have a mortgage payment that goes from 3.5% to 7%, that means your mortgage bill has doubled, and your monthly mortgage bill has doubled, which is a 100% increase, is essentially in the price of credit. So I think that's the most, and that doesn't get incorporated well into the CPI measures. It's supposed to be, but it's not. And some people have discussed that, but I raised that a long time ago, that once you have inflation and the Fed starts fighting it with rate hikes, the real big price change is the price of borrowing money, essentially. And you see that in housing, where unfortunately, that seems to have it led to higher housing prices as opposed to lower. So the intent of rate hikes many times is to try to stimulate or destimulate, cut back demand for credit-sensitive markets, essentially. So the rate hikes are price controls. It's basically public price controls in credit markets, right? That's what that's the business that the Fed is in trying to set credit market prices through price controls in the short end of the yield curve. But when they're doing that for housing, the rapid rate hikes essentially made people not want to leave their house because they don't want to leave the low mortgage rate they got under COVID when rates were very, very low, to move to another house where they have a 7% mortgage rate. So the supply of housing has dried up dramatically, the inventory of what's available for sale in the markets. And when the supply goes down, prices go up as opposed to down. And that's a big deal because the rate hikes are supposed to reduce prices, but core CPI is 40% housing. And for housing, it appears that it's actually increased prices.
What should be done to make housing more affordable for Americans?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is supply, and also obviously rates needs to come down for the cost of, but most people can't afford paying cash for their houses. They have to borrow the money. So rates have to come down. But in order for housing prices to come down as well, there's a lot of supply restrictions in many cities that have very, very high prices, especially on the West Coast, essentially, which makes it hard for people to come in and fill that supply and therefore lower prices. I think that's a major issue. And people were kind of scared also to build after the financial crisis, obviously. But we need to increase the supply dramatically to get prices down.
Okay, you mentioned credit. Is it a surprise to you, Tomas, that yes, interest rates have gone up for consumers and the government, but when you look at consumer debt, the level of credit card debt has never been higher, almost at $1 trillion, actually surpassing $1 trillion this past quarter, Tomas. So interest expenses have gone up, interest rates have gone up, and the level of credit at households has also gone up. How can you explain this phenomenon?
Well, I mean, they're being squeezed, right? So when inflation goes up and your paycheck is not reaching far enough, you have to basically borrow to make it work out for you. And that's the situation people are in. And that's why it's so concerning that rates are high, because they're getting squeezed on both ends. They can't afford the goods, and then they have to borrow to afford them. But then they're squeezed with higher credit or higher interest rates on the borrowing, essentially. And that's not a good cycle, neither for households nor the government. On the government side, it's the rate high. I mean, during COVID, we took on a lot more debt, right? But we were reducing rates of interest. So the payments, the servicing costs for the government is a product of how big is the debt times the interest on that debt. It's true for your car payment too. How big a loan do you have and what's your interest on your car loan? So during COVID, actually, there wasn't much of an effect on servicing costs because interest rates were going down simultaneously as the debt level rose. Then what happened, obviously, is that interest rate went up, and we're still piling on more debts. And that's why we have this exponential growth now in the servicing costs of that debt, which has now exceeded, as you probably hear very often, it's exceeded our defense spending, our servicing costs for the debt.
Is that going to have any immediate impact on the economy? The fact that the servicing cost is over $1 trillion now?
I mean, it's certainly crowding out other types of spending in the federal budget. So if you look at the big items, Social Security and Medicare, very few people want to touch that. Then you have defense, it's also hard to touch. And then you have interest rate payments. Those are the big four. And if you're not among those big four, it's going to be a lot of pressure to not increase spending on those other items.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, Tomas. I want to ask you about your outlook on the economy. Americans are concerned about whether or not this recession that's been talked about a lot, that hasn't come yet officially, is still going to come. Do you foresee a recession still in the works, and B, higher unemployment, even from 4%?
Yeah, no smart economist I know try to predict either the stock market nor the economy. Okay, and the people who think they can do it just don't understand how little they know. If they knew with certainty how to predict the economy or stock market, they should be trillionaires, but they're not, essentially. So I think it's very, very hard to predict. We've seen this cycle as well, where everyone predicted the recession in 23. That never came, essentially. The economy's been very, very resilient in regards to that. There was a lot of money pumped in with the COVID money, obviously, but we don't know. I think what is here to sort of lingering stay, I think, is the inflation. It's kind of ticking around 3 or 3.5% annualized, and that seems to be pretty sticky going forward.
The outlook for the standard of living, what can be done in terms of public policy to increase real wages for the average American?
Well, certainly not the tax hikes that are being proposed on companies. So the tax reductions from 35% to 21% of the corporate tax stimulated a lot of real wage growth. Basically, it's not it basically made the poor gain faster in income than the rich at the time. And I think that's the most important part on the federal policy side, is to cut spending. Spending can basically be financed in various ways. You can tax people to finance that spending, you can borrow to finance it, or you can print money to basically pay for the new spending. All three of those are very, very hurtful. And we're at higher spending levels now in peacetime than we've ever been before. And I think that's the number one priority if I was to advise either Congress or the president, to cut that spending, and regardless of how you finance it.
I appreciate your time today, Tomas. Where can we learn more about you and your work?
I am on LinkedIn and under my name, Tomas without an H, Philipson, and I post all my TV stuff and op-eds and stuff all there.
Okay, good. We'll follow up with you then. And thank you again. We'll speak again soon. Cheers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.